Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. So I'm Tyson, and for those unfamiliar with my organization, Public Citizen has been around since 1971. We're one of America's largest consumer advocacy groups. We work on a huge array of issues, and I just run our energy and climate work. I mainly focus on FERC jurisdictional markets. I also serve on an advisory committee to the Commodity Futures Trading Commission on their Energy and Environmental Markets Advisory Committee. So I do a lot of work on the federal level, and things typically look pretty bleak for consumer advocates on energy policy issues. But I do see some opportunities, and I think it kind of revolves around the Environmental Protection Agency proposed rule over greenhouse gas emissions. So first, a little bit of background. In 2007, the Supreme Court, in a decision called Massachusetts versus EPA, ruled that the EPA must regulate greenhouse gas emissions under its existing Clean Air Act authority if it found that greenhouse gas emissions were a public threat. And in December of 2009, the Obama administration, based upon the Supreme Court mandate, came up with an endangerment finding, which then triggered greenhouse gas emission rules for tailpipe emissions for automobiles, and then eventually over point source emissions such as power plants. In the summer of 2012, a federal appeals court upheld the administration's scientific endangerment finding after a challenge by the Chamber of Commerce and other industry-funded lobbying and trade groups that had challenged the science behind climate change. And the federal appeals court, led by David Santel, a Republican judge nominated by Ronald Reagan, in a federal court, looked at the scientific evidence for climate change and found that the EPA had conclusively and thoroughly made its case. So in a federal court, the issue of the science behind climate change is a done deal. And so the administration already finalized and implemented, with the cooperation of the automobile manufacturing industry, greenhouse gas emission standards for tailpipe emissions that they folded into their existing CAFE fuel economy standards. So in June of this year, the administration unveiled its proposed rules over coal-fired power plants. Now, this has generated an enormous amount of controversy. The Chamber of Commerce, in the days before the rules were released, issued a huge report by Daniel Yergin's group out of Boston, Massachusetts, concluding that the EPA rules, even though they weren't public yet, would result in hundreds of billions of dollars in unnecessary costs, result in hundreds of thousands of Americans losing their jobs. Every Tea Partier and Republican and some Democrats picked up on this report and quoted it extensively on the floor of Congress. All of it was complete garbage. The Chamber of Commerce report was one of the shoddiest written things. If Public Citizen had written this report, we would have been laughed out of the room. Daniel Yergin and his crew wrote it. I don't know if you're familiar with who Daniel Yergin is. He's one of the premier energy policy experts. He has frequent access to the White House and to top congressional leadership. He holds a couple of big annual conferences that bring in all of the top names in the policy and business world, and his report was a complete hack job. Almost all of the costs, when you dove into the details of their report, assume that the EPA would require carbon capture and sequestration for existing natural gas power plants. I don't know of anybody in the power sector that has ever proposed CCS for existing natural gas. It was a laughable assumption that was necessary to highly inflate the numbers. So, because we have to remember that the Chamber of Commerce has not been acting like a traditional policy debate organization. They are acting more as an electoral organization that is interested in furthering arguments to satisfy certain election outcomes, and so they are looking at the EPA rules as something from a campaign perspective rather than a serious policy discussion. So we took a look at the rules. We had a series of meetings with top EPA officials, and I got to tell you that these proposed rules over existing coal-fired power plants are remarkably and incredibly modest. What they say is that their goal is to achieve a 30% emissions reductions over 2005 emission levels by the year 2030. Now keep in mind that from 2005 to 2013, greenhouse gas emissions from the power sector already went down by almost 13%. So before the rule even goes into effect, we're almost halfway to the finish line, which gives us well more than a decade to obtain the remainder of the emission reductions. And what's very important about what the EPA has proposed is that it is not your typical EPA regulation. It doesn't say, okay, coal-fired operators of coal-fired power plants, you're going to have to get massive efficiency reductions or improvements in your facilities to reduce emissions at your source, or else you're going to be forced to shut down. In fact, the EPA has not proposed that. What instead they're saying is, we're going to give states and entire utility operation systems an ability to work what's known as outside the fence. We are going to allow for investments in energy efficiency, in renewable energy, to count towards emission reduction targets. So not only is the emission reduction goal very modest, it essentially locks in the status quo development that we're seeing in emissions reductions that's partly in response to the economic downturn. It's partly in response to successful energy efficiency programs at the state level already underway. It's partially due to the growth of lower carbon sources like natural gas because of market dynamics, where natural gas has been, for the most part, relatively cheap relative to coal, and the large deployment of renewables, both utility scale and distributed generation. And so the EPA rule is essentially just cementing into regulation what is already largely occurring in the marketplace. So the first thing to really understand about the EPA rule is that it's not some big draconian thing. This is actually very modest, and that's why, although you've seen the Chamber of Commerce and different coal mining companies attacking the rule with vigor, electric utilities, even coal-heavy ones like Southern Company, have not issued statements critical of the rule, because the utilities, when they looked at the details of the rule, and they were meeting with top EPA officials the same way that I was, they understand that what the EPA is doing is allowing states enormous flexibility to design compliance programs. So the schedule of events is the proposed rule was issued in June of this year. Comments are due by October, and Public Citizen is going to be submitting some. We would like other consumer groups to join us, and so we'll be available to do some collaborative work on that, and we're happy to also talk to community action groups and other stakeholders on ways to engage in the comment period where you may not have the time or the resources to read through the rule. So we're happy to help you. Either you can join with our comments, or we'll help you with some separate, simple comments that you could write. So they're going to accept comments until October. The final rule, the goal is to have it in place by June of 2015. At that point, the states then have 2 or 3 years to submit their state implementation plans of how they're going to comply with the EPA rule. So if a state is going to go on its own and do its own rule by June of 2017, they've got to submit a draft plan of how they're going to comply. If states want to work together in a regional cooperative effort, they're given an extra year until June of 2018 to submit their plans. So this is several years that our advocate network is going to have an opportunity to weigh in not only at the EPA, but at the state level where all of the action is going to happen. And I come back to the fact that electric utilities have not been trashing this rule because they recognize that they have leverage in state legislatures, at state utility commissions, to try and influence state proposals to maximize benefit for their shareholders. And what we need to do is to recognize that we have to be playing in this game, because these EPA rules, while they might not be in our radar screens, we might already have our plates filled with a lot of other stuff that we have to do every day. But the fact of the matter is that these, the details of how the states are going to implement this are going to impact our constituents, and it's important for us to be involved. So Public Citizen has just kind of come up with 5 key things that we are urging the EPA to advise states to adapt as part of their state implementation plans, because the EPA can't really force states to come up with a set plan. The EPA can allow a state to come up with a carbon tax. It can expand an existing renewable portfolio standard to include energy efficiency targets. States can create their own regional greenhouse gas initiatives the way the Northeast has, or expand on that existing network. California has its own sweeping climate change law that many elements of that are going to be successfully come into compliance for the EPA rules. So while the EPA can't require states to come up with a specific plan, they're allowing states to kind of pick and choose from a whole bunch of existing suite of things, and that maximum flexibility is what the utilities are counting on, and it's what we in the consumer advocate world have to be very honed in on. So the first thing that we have urged the EPA to ask states to consider is to remind states that we're dealing with a critical resource, electric service, that it has to be, that we've got to understand that this is an opportunity to try and improve certain low-income consumer protections for access to utility service, whether it's folks that are behind on paying their bills and what types of management programs we can put folks on, whether it's disconnection standards. It's an opportunity for our advocate networks to strengthen some of these existing standards, because one thing that the EPA and states are going to be very sensitive to are allegations that the rule is going to result in worse service for households and higher utility bills. And so that gives us some leverage to talk about strengthening existing standards. And so I think that that is one of the core principles that we've been shopping to the EPA, and that the next phase is going to be going to the states with model efforts on that. The second big issue here is going to be a rush towards decoupling, I'm afraid, on the part of electric utilities. They're going to see an opportunity to try and use this rule as an opportunity to expand existing or create new decoupling programs, which are highly problematic from a lot of consumer advocate perspectives. And that's why we've made this clear in our meetings with EPA, but we've got to emphasize the point and take it to the states that there has to be that energy efficiency programs and initiatives to comply with this rule have to be cost effective and demonstrate specific and verifiable energy savings for households. And this is going to be a very key point to make because the utilities are going to be pushing as aggressively as they can to maximize returns to their shareholders, and we have to remind the states and EPA that only plans that maximize value to household consumers, and particularly to low-income consumers, should be considered. A second or a third reform issue that we have shopped to the EPA is to emphasize the need for so-called intervenor funding mechanisms at the state level. It's important to recognize that there's going to be a lot of different agencies at the state level involved in crafting and implementing the compliance programs for this EPA greenhouse gas emission rule. You're going to have governors and their offices involved. You're going to have input from the legislature, but a lot of the heavy lifting is going to be by public utility commissions. And as we all know, public interest groups and groups representing consumers, and particularly low-income consumers, the deck is stacked against us in terms of being able to effectively intervene in public utility proceedings, getting appropriate legal counsel, having all the resources we need, hiring of expert witnesses, and a model exists in California with its intervenor funding statute that allows for groups that are representing consumers in the public interest that end up having an impact in the outcome of a rule at a public utility commission proceeding. They can get compensated for their costs of intervention. And our friends at the Utility Reform Network, or TURN, in San Francisco, California, which is a fantastic consumer advocacy group that I'm proud to work with on a number of issues. They've got a team of, I believe, at least 10 attorneys that are funded entirely through the intervenor funding mechanism in the state of California. And in a little known fact, there's actually a provision in federal law, in the Federal Power Act, as part of the 1978 PURPA amendments, that authorized FERC to create an Office of Public Participation that included an intervenor funding mechanism. It's never been utilized by FERC, of course, but precedent exists in federal law, and we've got several states, the best being California, that we can point to maximize consumer protection by maximizing consumer involvement. And intervenor funding has to be a key to that. We've seen in some of the RGGI programs, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative program, which has a very small carbon price as determined by a regular auction on existing coal and other fossil fuel plants there. You've got mechanisms in some of the RGGI states where you've got robust stakeholder processes where consumers, environmental groups, state officials, utilities all have a seat at the table in coming up with the design and implementation of energy efficiency programs that are funded by the auction revenues from RGGI. We think that this holds an excellent blueprint for how some of these programs can be developed at the state level. It's something that folks at EPA were really enthusiastic about. And again, EPA can make recommendations to states to adopt these, and we want to push EPA to require them to help ensure that these state implementation plans are going to successfully comply with the rule. And last is, the administration and the EPA is banking heavily on renewable deployments to substitute for retiring coal plants to meet some of the emission standards. And some of this is going to be utility scale and, utility scale renewables and cost competitiveness of these systems varies greatly by region. You do have some examples like what the city of Austin just did a couple months ago with Recurrent Energy, where they signed a 20-year power purchase agreement for a 150 megawatt photovoltaic solar system under construction in West Texas at 4.9 cents a kilowatt hour, which is a rate lower than what prevailing rates are for the city of Austin. So that's a pretty big deal. And the key to that was obviously a 20-year power purchase agreement which helps bring down costs. That's something that isn't a feature of some of the big restructured markets like PJM and so forth. But there's going to be a big push under the rule for greater adaptation of distributed generation, and this kind of meshes with a lot of the trends we're seeing generally in the utility industry. You know, the Edison Electric Institute came out with their big white paper in January of 2013 talking about disruptive technologies like rooftop solar. A lot of that's in the commercial sector, but a lot of the new rooftop installations have been through third-party leasing programs by companies like Solar City. And while many of those have the promise of lower electric bills over time, the devil is in the details of those contracts. And there's no standardized consumer protections embedded in those. And that's something we've urged the EPA to look at, and it's something we're going to be bringing to the states. Because it's one thing to say we want to see more distributed generation, we want to see more consumers generating their own electricity, but if it's all being done in Beverly Hills and not in other neighborhoods, that's not meeting the goal of equity. And I think that has to be the number one priority in any sort of renewable energy deployment goal. Is equity has to be an even goal with deployment. And ensuring that we've got some stronger consumer protections and stronger goals as part of that is going to be key. So that's it in a nutshell. It's you know, it's a media circus. Anytime you talk about EPA rules, I go on cable news shows a lot, from CNN to Fox and MSNBC, and every time I go on Fox on this, it turns into an insane shouting match. Why I continue to go on the network, I'm not really sure. I guess I like a challenge. And so you are going to have some states that are going to, that have political establishments that think that they can probably score more points by demonizing the rule. We just saw a lawsuit by 12 states attacking the rule as being illegal. There are going to be a lot of legal challenges thrown to the EPA, but given the track, it's impossible to predict exactly how all these things are going to shake out, but the courts generally provide an awful lot of deference to the EPA, particularly if they see that they've done a lot of due diligence. And there's no question that Gina McCarthy, the EPA administrator, I think has done a pretty admirable job of actually reaching out to utilities, reaching out to other stakeholders to come up with a rule that's actually incredibly modest and actually fairly manageable. The key is going to make sure that utilities, by their influence at the state level, don't turn a manageable, fairly benign rule into something that becomes too expensive for some of our folks. And so that's all I've got right now. So I'm happy to take any questions from people remotely or people here, whatever you guys want to do.
You mentioned commenting on the EPA rule, and you mentioned that you're organizing other organizations to do it. What do you see the steps as being for organizing at the state level once we've gotten through the federal comment process, which is the first obvious sort of watershed of comments and organizing?
Yeah, Meg, great question. So I think first and foremost is making sure that we've got some state-based organizations that are going to be able to weigh in at the state level. And Public Citizen has, you know, we're a pretty limited resource organization. You know, we're working a lot with National Consumer Law Center on some of these issues. And so we can help with some of the technical analysis, but what we want to do is partner with consumer groups or community action organizations at the state level and come up with a formal proposal that doesn't have to be overly detailed or complex, but kind of hits on some of the key issues. I mean, we're all already working on implementing or even helping to design certain energy efficiency programs. And so focusing in on what works for us and coming up with a short list of key priorities that we can take to the states and to the EPA, because the EPA ultimately has to approve all of this, and there is going to be some back and forth negotiation between EPA officials and the states as the design process moves forward, and making sure that we've got, you know, some of these key consumer protection benchmarks as part of our advocacy work is going to be essential. So Meg, I don't know if that addresses your question.
I think I have a follow-up to that, which is one of the things that we might want to comment on, how much authority is given to the states.
In what context? You mean that the EPA might be delegating too much to the states?
Yes, that's a possibility.
I mean, that is the structure at this point, is that the EPA is, what the EPA has done is basically it's set, there isn't, I said that the rule seeks to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 30% over 2005 emission levels by the year 2030. I know that's an insane sentence, and I've said it like a million times, but I hope it's clear. But that implies that there's a national standard. It isn't. It's actually, what this rule is a 50-state standard. And so when you look at the EPA rule, there is a different standard for all 50 states that is essentially measured by pounds of CO2 emissions per megawatt hour. And so every state has a different formula, and it's based upon their 2002 portfolio. And so, you know, what Gina McCarthy, I think, was trying to avoid was allegations that the EPA was coming in with a big government, heavy-handed, one-size-fits-all approach, which is why when she consulted with the utilities, they came up with this state-based approach. So I think that there are going to be challenges because some of us have very good positions within states, and others we're at a distinct disadvantage relative to the utility sector. And so that is going to be a challenge. I don't think that we're going to be successful in pushing for less flexibility as part of this rule. I think that's going to be a tougher sell than in trying to get more influence and access at the state level, with the EPA having our back, and that's going to be the key component here. The EPA isn't, you know, they've liked all the suggestions we've made, but they haven't said, okay, we're going to be your advocates and salespeople for your positions. That we're not there yet, and that's what we're going to continue to work on. Does that address your question?
Yeah. Other questions?
Hi.
Hi. So what are the EPA's intended teeth with this? So, you know, they can put out guidance until they're blue in the face, but even if our comments are targeted to the EPA and are successful and they include in their guidance all kinds of great things, what kind of, are there going to be any teeth there, or is this just, I mean, when they come out with their plans, it's kind of whatever the state does?
I mean, the EPA, at the end of the day, has to validate the state proposal. So I said that the states have to have a draft proposal in beginning in June of 2017. And for those states doing a multi-state approach, June 2018. Then there's going to be a year after those dates of public comment and review on the state proposal. And that's going to be a big opportunity to try and get improvements. Obviously, I think given the several-year lead time until June 2017 when single state plans are due in a draft form, there is some opportunity to try and, in some of our states, get some of the core consumer principles locked into that. But there is going to be, the EPA is putting out a guidance, but there is teeth in the form of the EPA has to give it its stamp of approval at the end of the day. And the EPA does have some leverage. The question is, how much are they going to push on this? And I think some of that comes down to how well consumer advocates can make our case that, listen, the Chamber of Commerce is making up numbers here, but the fact of the matter is, if we want to really ensure that consumers are protected, here are some simple things that states can do to give consumers a greater voice and help ensure that these rules are not going to result in price increases, particularly among the most vulnerable of us. Did that address your question?
Well, so what happens when, so I can see our governor, current governor.
And in what state are you?
Pennsylvania.
Oh, okay.
I hail from the great state of Pennsylvania. Our current governor, who hopefully won't continue to be governor, I could see him saying, we're just not going to submit a plan. So
right.
What kind of leverage does the EPA have over that?
The EPA, if a state fails to implement a plan, the EPA will implement a plan for the state. Now, the EPA has, in their proposed rule, has not indicated what that would be. So they are assuming that states will try and be smart. But we saw from the Obamacare debacle where a alarming number of governors saw fit to score a political point by creating direct economic harm to their poorest residents. It's amazing that people aren't in the streets about that. So yes, there is absolutely, I already mentioned that 12 states already filed a lawsuit that is largely with the November election in mind, right? Because among a certain core group of regular registered voters, attacks on Obamacare, attacks on EPA regulation, attacks on government broadly score very well. And so that's why I was saying that elements of this EPA debate speak more about electoral strategies than they do about a true policy debate, which is unfortunate. Because I do think that climate change is a very important issue to address. But at the end of the day, my main focus is ensuring that households have access to affordable and reliable energy. So this is going to be a challenge, is those states that fail. I think the wild card here are going to be the utilities, because the utilities do not want a state to reject coming up with a plan, because then the utility is going to have to depend upon the EPA to draw up a plan. The utilities don't want to take that gamble, right? It's in the utilities' best interest to work the state, because for the most part, that's where they have more leverage. But as we've seen, especially with certain Tea Party elements that actively sometimes buck established corporate lobbying trade associations, that might get a little dicey. So, we're in a very strange political era right now, and that makes planning for some of these things a little complicated. There's a segment of the political population that wants America to return to an era that never existed, and that makes things a little frustrating. People laugh, but that's exactly what's going on.
It's a felicitous phrase.
Yes.
You have at least one question from off-site. Can Misty tell the question?
Sure. So I'm right here. And I have several questions and a couple of comments. The first question on a related topic is, how is this effort parallel with what other countries are doing? And is there value about having common goals and measures and standards?
Right. Excellent question. First of all, there is no question that this rule fits in with a global strategy on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The most important thing about global warming, and again, I believe very firmly in the science of it, that global climate change requires a global solution, right? Because the United States could reduce our emissions to near zero, and if China keeps building a new coal-fired power plant every week, none of that's going to matter. We've had this chicken and egg situation in international negotiations over reaching a binding global treaty, where China essentially says, we'll do something when the United States has a plan. And the United States says, well, we'll do something when China comes to the table with a plan. With this proposed rule, the Obama administration can legitimately now say the United States has plans in place that address more than 75% of greenhouse gas emissions for the energy sector in the United States when it's combined with tailpipe emissions and the existing power plants. What say you, China? What are you going to do? So I think that this rule helps end that chicken and egg debate over who's going to act first, and actually gives the United States some leverage, because Barack Obama has made very clear in a number of his international appearances that he wants one of his legacies to be real binding global action on climate change. So I do think that the rule is actually very relevant for that. I think he and a lot of other people preferred a legislative approach to it. That's not happening, right? This Congress can't even name post offices in a coherent manner, let alone set sweeping energy or climate policies. So given that fact, the EPA has this authority, given it to it by the Supreme Court. So I do think that it's helpful. And the second part of your question, I don't know if that pertained to international standards or state standards.
International.
Yeah,
I got international standards from the question asker.
Yeah, so I think that what the EPA is proposing can definitely be put in to be a cog in the wheel of a global treaty, and I think that's exactly what you're going to see over the next few months. I forget when the next big climate meeting is. I think it's in Germany in a couple weeks or a couple months. I don't have a budget to go on these junkets like a lot of environmental advocates do, so I don't get to travel to these far-flung European capitals. And to be honest, if I did have a budget, I wouldn't spend it on that. That the next, Obama has already said that he will attend the next one, which, like I said, I think is in Germany within a couple months or a couple weeks. And you can guarantee that he's going to tout these EPA rules as a foundation of a part of a binding global treaty. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, excellent. Thank you. And then I have a comment and then another question. So Ludwig Kozlowski, sorry Ludwig if I terribly messed up your name. He has neither a camera nor a mic, but he does have speakers. So he would like to just reiterate that your number 3 point is very critical and important, especially in Arkansas, which must be where he's at, with the ongoing involvement in EE issues. And having a seat at the table is time-consuming and not inexpensive. So that's his comment that he would like to share. And then our next question comes from Margot Bryant, and she would like to know, how does cost-effective mandates impact low-income weatherization programs, which are difficult to meet cost-effective goals and can sometimes be considered customer service programs to avoid cost of effective mandates? And she said that correlates to your step 2 slide. So that's a little bit of a long question, but if you need me to repeat, let me know.
I'm not sure that a requirement that energy efficiency programs demonstrate cost effectiveness for targeted recipients of those programs is a hurdle or a barrier that is going to be a problem. I think that there are so many cost-effective energy efficiency initiatives spearheaded by states and utilities with the active participation of consumer groups and community action agencies that can be used as models of successful compliance. So that the EPA, in its rule, does have a big verification system where they're going to be reviewing all of these energy efficiency programs to ensure that they're going to be effective, and we're just going to be emphasizing that cost effectiveness has to be a big priority for these programs. I don't know if you have anything you want to add, Meg.
I think that probably only in California are weatherizers in the conventional program having a chance to deal with a different kind of cost effectiveness, meaning not even social benefits, but carbon benefits, and what that does to the reallocation of resources or the choice of measures. So for the rest of the delivery network for low-income utility programs of today, we've got the social benefits that have been built into some of the rates, but also we need to quickly, I think, within a year, think through what the model is that meets carbon goals and doesn't run into the pitfalls of dealing with conventional tests or even new tests that become conventional to the rest of the industry. So that's going to be sort of fun. And I have a question to, when you were answering Elizabeth Mark's question, you rather quickly said that we have to, what the goals were, that we're working on inclusion and distribution goals, and that we have to have the states adopt a process that lets the consumer voice be heard. I want to just elaborate on that process a little bit, that not just sitting at the table maybe, but some kind of intervener, knowing what you've been trying to do for years and thinking that you're thinking about intervention on a formal and well-paid basis.
Right. Well, so talking about like the California model, or
whatever you want to talk about.
Right. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the California model. You know, Mark Toney is the executive director of this group, Turn, and I've had a lot of conversations with him about it. And you know, he said, look, it's not perfect. There's times when the reimbursements come too late, and you know, we're forced to do a lot of juggling with our budget. But he's like, there's no question that it is effective, and that without it, it is their attorneys work full time, and like I said, I think the last time I talked to him, he's got at least 10 attorneys whose salaries, benefits, everything is 100% paid for through the intervener compensation mechanism. The key to how it works in California is that the merits of the application are not decided by the utility commissioners, but rather by administrative law judges. So there's a degree of independence there that is very helpful, because as we know, winds can change with different public utility commissions, and sometimes we get some good, thoughtful, progressive folks, and sometimes not so much. So that's been critically important. The one issue is that you've got to demonstrate, and the administrative law judge has to conclude that your efforts made an impact in the final decision. And that's actually, Mark has told me, a fairly low bar to be able to set. You know, like I said, there's other states that have intervener funding mechanisms that are not nearly as robust, as well funded, or as independent as the California system. And so it's always easier. So, you know, I understand some of us work in states where we say, well, California does it, and that will automatically mean that it's not going to happen in your state. But the fact that we've got language in federal law, the fact that we do have other states, you know, Wisconsin and a few others, that have some limited intervener funding mechanisms, I do think that this is an opportunity for us to expand this really important tool, because I think it has been successful where it's been implemented.
I did have a question, but after listening to some of your answers to other questions, it's now just more of a comment or two. I'm from West Virginia, so if you think Pennsylvania's bad, well, yeah, you can imagine what's going on in our state. And the discussions in our state and the
upcoming elections really concern me, especially in my state, because I see what's going on with our U.S. Senate and House of Representatives positions switching parties and just a very conservative mindset. Some of what you talked about, Tyson, reminds me of electricity dereg in the late 1990s, early 2000s, when community action associations and networks had to ramp up the speed with knowledge and education and then get involved as interveners in a lot of these discussions. So about half of the states then deregulated, and hopefully at least half of those states had low-income consumer protections or programs. And so now we have this opportunity coming up, but I see this election as, at least in my little neck of the woods, very concerning because of what may happen during that time. And I know NASCASP has a weatherization carbon program that they've been working on. They've run into all kinds of difficulties with it, but nonetheless still working on it. And I guess the statement is I hope that our advocates at our state, community action associations, our national associations, our local agencies maybe can even work with you to know what to say and do and get involved in our states with very little money but still have a voice. It'll be tough.
Yeah, I would be extremely happy to work with you. And you know, we're already seeing some unfortunate trends. So one aspect of the EPA rule, for example, encourages states to develop subsidy programs to keep existing nuclear power plants online to help count towards emission reductions. So the EPA does not mandate it because they can't, but they say we really encourage states to come up with something. And just this week, PJM, which is the largest restructured privately run marketplace in the United States, just launched an internal stakeholder rulemaking process to give out-of-market payments to aging nuclear and coal units for reliability reasons in light of the price spikes that we saw in parts of PJM during the so-called polar vortex. So what you're going to see is utilities with some power generators seizing on some of these EPA allowable subsidy programs to funnel money into those areas when they ought to be funneling that money into energy efficiency programs and weatherization and other things that I think will have greater value for more household consumers. And so it's definitely, you know, it's going to be a big battle, but you know, everything is always a big battle. So there's no easy thing when it comes to dealing with energy and climate.
And what was it you said was some of the good news at the beginning? Is that just that this is happening and there's an opportunity?
The good news is that the rule is actually very modest, and that the EPA is allowing states to kind of be incubators for doing this stuff. And so the good news is that gives us an opportunity to work with states. I'm always an optimist. I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if I wasn't. If I was cynical, I would have accepted a job with Goldman Sachs a while ago. Maybe I should have. Then I could just give my money to charity. No, I would have been miserable.
All right, I've got a couple more comments that you might want to weigh in on. The first is from Jeff Mark. He says, states should have the authority. I see FERC being a bigger issue. Reliability purposes regarding low income and energy savings attributed to low income programs should count for more. Otherwise, this becomes much tougher. So any comments on that? Or I have one more comment from
I don't have any comments on that comment.
Okay. And then the second is from a follow-up from Margot Bryant. It says, won't this mandated cost effectiveness force low-income weatherization programs to become effective programs rather than customer service programs? I believe this mandate would destroy some low-income conservation programs. I am so leery when anyone mandates the weatherization program to be cost-effective. There are current challenges to build cost-effective programs for both electric and certainly natural gas. How would you propose separating low-income from regular programs?
How would I feel about?
How would you propose separating low-income from regular programs?
Well, there are some states that do have a separate. I mean, there are some separate federal initiatives that target low-income consumers, and there are states that have separate programs. And oh, okay. So I'm not. I think there's other people in the room that have more on-the-ground expertise on designing and implementing those programs than I do. But like I said, there is an enormous number of examples at the state level of successful implementation of programs for low-income consumers that can successfully weather the cost-effectiveness test.
I want to make a comment and ask Margot a question, or clarification. I think the question you're asking is how can low-income programs meet the cost-effectiveness rate of return test that other sectors' programs meet in the utility portfolio? And maybe you can just signal back to Misty if that's what you meant. As Tyson said, most of the robust low-income programs involve other values as well as simple total cost test or return on that simple investment over a short period of time. They involve considerations of durability as well as considerations of social benefits. And somewhere underlying it is, gee, poor people are paying for this, and it's the stuff that's going into upper-income folks' homes, because upper-income folks are getting a rebate for something expensive that they bought, and guess who just paid for it? So that is kind of an underlying unmeasurable factor in commission decisions, though you could probably measure it. So I mean, you could turn around and do a suggestion that based on social costs, a deep retrofit program that had measures that were going to last as long as whatever the building is would be the best low-income strategy, even though it's quite different from what would be subsidized for another sector. But I think you're right that low-income residential programs will not produce the savings that other sectors, commercial, industrial, and so forth, are going to show up with. Elizabeth, you got your mic on, good.
I'd just like to weigh in on that, because in Pennsylvania, and I think tying together some of the many things we've been talking about, but in Pennsylvania we have this unique issue now where our low-income programs have reached what even our consumer advocate believes is maturity. So they don't want to grow those programs, and they don't want to grow the costs on the tariff programs. So we're, as the low-income attorneys for the statewide legal aid program, we're put in a position where we're trying to argue that we should expand low-income programs, and at the same time, people want to expand energy efficiency programs. And so we're meeting this head where unless we can prove the value added other than cost efficiency, and I think there's so much more to cost efficiency, but even getting consumer advocates to note that it's worth the increased cost to residential people, residential ratepayers, to increase money going into those programs, like we're at a loss for how to argue that. You know, we believe in the value added, but how do we get others to believe in that value added beyond the energy efficiency or the cost-benefit ratio that you get?
And Meg, I'll just add to that, that Margot sent a note back saying, and I think as an example, that The programs where she's at include no-cost whole house retrofits.
Right, and that's Pennsylvania's program and many of the other 35 robust low-income programs nationwide in the utility sector. I want to put in a pitch for the session tomorrow afternoon where I'm having Adam Cooper and I together. Adam Cooper's from Edison Foundation and has been looking along with another organization named CEE, which is, maybe Margot is part of that. It's the Managers of Efficiency Programs at Utilities, produces an annual report showing the current and projected growth in efficiency funding. And it's not only that it has grown dramatically since 2008, this is ratepayer money, but that it is projected to grow as much as it has in the last 5 years over the next 5 years. So there's quite a lot of growth in both utilities, but mostly electric field. And the low-income part of that has grown a little, but it stayed fairly constant while all the other sectors grew. So we're going to be talking about why anything is growing as a burden on the ratepayer, and what's worth doing, and what the opportunities are for low-income ratepayer funding to catch a part of the growth that's going to happen anyway. So come back at 2 o'clock tomorrow on that one. Did I cut off somebody else, Misty, who you were? Thank you guys so much for being with us today. Thank you, Tyson, for bringing us to an action moment, an inflection point where we've got to think about the next set of things to do and whom we're going to do it with. Clearly, Public Citizen is going to be in the lead, but we've got a lot of interested parties out here.
We need help, and we're happy to work with folks.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for the opportunity today.
Thank you.